So this is a video about Haunted Castle Revisited, but let's talk about something completely different first. The Castlevania The Adventure series. Originally starting on the Game Boy back in 1989, the first entry was bad, and while Legends was a little rough, Belmont's Revenge was an incredible game, one of my favourites in the entire franchise. And then it lay dormant. For 12 years, the Adventure series was just 3 games on the Game Boy, until in 2009, it got a new entry on WiiWare, Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth. Meant to be a remake of the original game, but having barely anything to do with it apart from sharing its protagonist and having a stronger focus on platforming, Rebirth is absolutely phenomenal. Densely packed, platform-strewn levels, filled to the brim with alternate paths and secrets to find, all styled like a souped-up SNES game, complete with that classic Konami sound in the soundtrack. You know the one. The pew pew. A beautiful love letter to the lesser-known games of the franchise, and an incredible second chance for the adventure. It, Belmont's Revenge, and Rondo of Blood make up my holy trilogy of favourite classic Castlevania games. And now here we are 15 years later. Konami are doing it again, this time giving Haunted Castle, often regarded as the worst Castlevania game ever made, to the same team behind Rebirth to give it the same treatment. Haunted Castle Revisited, bundled as an extra game in the recently released Dominus collection. Developed by the same team, complete with rolling eyeballs, limited time whip upgrades, and the same stage clear screen. Fuck it, close enough. The 5th game in the Adventure series is here. And as someone who over 1 decade and gender ago vowed to review every The Adventure game there was, I have no choice but to talk about it. So, let's talk about it. Except, actually, let's not do that, and first let me go on another tangent and talk about the original Haunted Castle, which was also included as an extra game in the collection. Like I said, it's often regarded as the worst in the franchise, but it was a game I was hoping I would have been able to come out of playing, being the needless contrarian I usually am, with my amazing taste in games and always correct opinions, and would have been able to see the positives in it and talk about how it's an underrated gem. The only flaw in that plan was actually having to play Haunted Castle. Originally released in arcades, coming out between Castlevania 2 and 3 in 1987, the game has a reputation for a reason. It is brutally difficult, basically one step away from just growing arms and shaking down the player themselves for their money. The series has always been difficult, but it's at least usually fair. This one is not. It will set off traps that are impossible to avoid unless you already played the game to know how to avoid them. Enemies will constantly spawn in spots that make it impossible for you to defend from, even spawning directly on top of you, and even spawning directly on top of you in a checkpoint. So even before you can move, you've already lost health. And even when not doing that, they come at you so fast that you need to react instantly in order to not take any damage from them. So it's a good thing that the controls are kinda crap, stiff, and finicky. Not that classic Castlevania isn't stiff, but at least those games are responsive. I actually swapped controllers halfway through playing because I thought it was broken, but no, the game's just like that. You can't input diagonals, which makes climbing stairs quickly a hassle, and I constantly found myself uncrouching when I didn't want to, which made dodging enemies feel a bit dodgy in places. As you can imagine then, the game is frustrating and difficult in the moment-to-moment gameplay, but as a package here in the collection, it isn't actually that difficult to finish despite that. The game is surprisingly generous. Checkpoints are frequent, so you don't have to worry about trying to beat these levels in one go, and you even keep all your items and upgrades when you die. The level design is pretty basic and almost entirely depends on just throwing loads of enemies at you to be hard, so you're basically just throwing yourself at waves of enemies over and over again until you push through, like throwing yourself at a brick wall until you're mushy enough to seep through the cracks and make it to the next checkpoint. It's a shame because there is, underneath all the bad, a lot of good here to enjoy. The graphics are really nice for the era, with big, detailed character sprites, which I've always loved the design of, ever since I stumbled across this game's existence as a kid scrolling through the Castlevania dungeon. Sure, the animation is a bit stiff. Simon walks like he's out here in Dracula's castle, turtle heading, but I think it still comes together to make a quite beautiful game, especially with all the attention to detail, like how the river turns red with blood when you first kill an enemy in this part of the stage, and while I honestly couldn't tell you if the different main weapons actually change how much damage you do, the progression of getting new ones as you go through the game felt really satisfying. The music is also really good, but this being a Castlevania game that kinda feels barely worth mentioning, that's just a given. This is, after all, the game whose high score table theme was deemed such a banger that it was chosen as a level theme in Rebirth, and some other certified hood classics also made their debut in this game too. Great sound effects as well, shout out the cartoon sound effect rock in level 2. Overall, it's a game that had a lot of potential, but was held back by poor level design, poor enemy placement, and its ruthlessness trying to get money from children in the 80s. The Dominus Collection version does its best to make it bearable to play through, letting you do things like spam the insert credit button to gain a silly amount of health, but it was still a pretty frustrating experience, so I can definitely see why Konami felt it was prime material for a Rebirth-esque remake. The fact that Haunted Castle Revisited exists makes me so happy in the stupidest way. The idea that this relatively obscure WiiWare game I loved so much, and thought had been completely forgotten by the company who made it, was almost certainly the inspiration and jumping off point for this game, brings more joy to me than playing through the game ever could. But I mean, it gets pretty close though. It's a good game. This is, simply put, the best Classicvania has ever felt. Incredibly smooth and responsive, but still with that sense of weight that makes it feel so satisfying to control. The whip cracks against enemies with real palpable force, especially when you pick up the second whip upgrade. A timed power-up that makes it deal even more damage, with bright sparks crashing off of it with every enemy you hit, really incentivizing you to push forward as fast as you can to make the most out of it. It's a lot better than Rebirth's limited time power-up, a piddly little fireball that mostly just hit stuff on the other side of the screen than what I was actually trying to hit. These upgrades make playing through the levels an absolute treat, even when really they haven't changed the levels all that much. Unlike Rebirth, which was a remake that remade nothing from the game it was meant to be a remake of, Revisited sticks very faithfully to its source material. The same 6 levels from the original game, pretty much exactly as they were, barring a few new areas and set pieces in each one, while also dialing back the bullshit. Traps are now clearly telegraphed, enemies no longer spawn on top of you and give you way more time to respond to their moves, so you can, actually respond to them. Crazy. Just really goes to show how close Haunted Castle was to already being a good game, when they had to change relatively little about it to make it feel so good. Like, it's still very identifiably Haunted Castle, in a way that Rebirth was not very identifiably The Adventure. The area that probably received the biggest upgrade, though, has got to be the bosses. I didn't mention them earlier because they were pretty forgettable and just kind of awful, honestly. They were all really easy and possible to kill within literal seconds of starting their fights. It might genuinely have the easiest final boss in the entire franchise, second only to Castlevania 2. But now they've all been given a whole litany of new attacks to throw at you, making for some really memorable encounters. From the genuinely, actually, kinda really scary second form of Dracula, to the silly, fishy flopping of the Glass Knight, and the skeleton who keeps pissing off Frankenstein's monster by electrocuting them. All the bosses are fun to fight against, even if not very hard compared to others in the franchise. It's a huge glow up over what was there before. The audio and visuals are also great. It doesn't really invoke a particular console era like Rebirth does. The closest games I could think to compare it to would be the DS ones, but it isn't trying to look like a DS game or restrict itself to what a DS could do. This is a fully fledged HD 2D, but not like that, Castlevania experience. Enemies blend keyframed animations with tweened secondary motions to create silky smooth movements, paired with beautifully detailed sprite work. The stages are a mix of typical looking video game backgrounds and these really awesome looking photo-bashed real life textures with an immersive sense of depth drawn from the various parallax layers in the distance. And while it is sadly missing the Blood Red River and cartoon sound effect rock, basically making it unplayable, I know, I love luxuriating on all the attention to detail that is there and soaking it all in. From the upside-down headstones hanging from the tree canopy in the graveyard, to the glistening cave structure the level boss slaloms between in the background of the stage, and the weird guys just kinda hanging out and chilling in prison. It's a gorgeous game to look at and listen to, with incredible remasters of all the game's original tracks that, sure, don't have that classic Konami pew sound, so marks down for that. Is that joke still funny? Was it ever? But they're still an absolute joy to listen to, though I won't go into any more detail than that because I don't know any of the right music words to describe any of it. It just sounds good and I like the guitars. Now, if you're watching this video and you're thinking that it feels like I'm just listing things about the game I like, then you're correct. There's a lot to love about this game. Like I said, this is the best playing Classicvania game I think there's ever been, so don't get me wrong, I think it's a great game. But it's also one I came away from feeling a little disappointed. And after going back and replaying a bunch of other Castlevania games for what I guess you could laughably call research for this video, and preferring them to Revisited in a lot of ways, I think I figured out why. And I think it's two problems that are intertwined: difficulty and its strict adherence to the source material. I think these really left a negative impression on me, despite how much good it does. Which is why I felt the need to say what I liked about it so much before I talk about these negative aspects. It's a good game, but I wish it could have been more. And even that is something I've struggled with when writing this video. How do I even evaluate this game? Like, is it fair for me to judge it as a game? I know that sounds stupid, but it isn't something you can buy on its own. You can only get it as part of the Dominus collection, and there it's listed as an extra. So, is it right for me to compare it to Rebirth and other Castlevania games when it's being presented here as just a bonus? I mean, it's meant to be a close reimagining of Haunted Castle, not its own unique game like Rebirth ended up being. So if I complain about how rigidly it sticks to that original game and how I think that harmed the original experience, is that a valid complaint? Or should I just accept it for what it is? Or am I just inventing this problem in my head, trying to come up with excuses for why this game that I really like still left me feeling a little disappointed and trying to cover its ass from my own critiques? I'm honestly not sure, but I'm going to go forward just judging it on its own for now, for the sake of my own sanity. But I do understand that maybe what I want from the game, and am going to bring up now, may have been out of scope for the project, or maybe not even what they wanted to do with it at all. So, with how closely it follows the original game, it is quite cool, right? It's fun playing through the original and seeing the same level design and set pieces reimagined in an actually good game. They do add some new obstacles to make the level design more interesting, and occasionally a new area or two, but despite that, it's still a very quick experience. All the levels are beatable in about 5 minutes. On top of that, there's only 6 of them, with the final one just being pretty much a straight line walk to Dracula. So although what is here is really good and really fun, it's over before you know it. I beat the whole game in 35 minutes, which, despite all the new stuff they added, is only 4 minutes longer than my time to beat the original. For reference, as part of my research, I also did runs of Dracula X, Chronicles, and Rebirth, and those took me an hour and a quarter, 2 hours, and an hour and 20 minutes respectively. I also stated in my review of Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge for the Game Boy that game took me an hour and 10 minutes to beat. So Revisited is quite a bit shorter, and it's not like those games had that many more stages either. In fact, Rebirth has the same amount of levels as Revisited. But I think it highlights 2 things about it I would have liked to have been different. One is just for them to have been a little less restrained on the levels, adding an additional full area to each level, or maybe even a new level entirely, would have been really nice to see. I could see one fitting nicely between stages 5 and 6, as 5 feels like a bit of an anticlimax leading into the final boss. Frankenstein's monster is a weird penultimate boss fight, and getting to see a haunted castle spin on the Grim Reaper in this hypothetical new level would have been cool. It would have also been a nice chance for a lullaby sent to the devils, the banging high score table theme in this game, to be used as a level theme again like in Rebirth. I didn't even hear this song in my playthrough. I genuinely don't know how to see the high score table in this game, which is a shame because it's probably my favourite song in the game. But honestly, the levels as they are now would probably be fine, if it wasn't for the second thing I wish was different. I wish the game was actually hard. I mean, it's Castlevania. Playing through those older games reminded me of how hard they could be. Brutally punishing at times, but always in a fair and enjoyable way. I'm obviously speaking a bit generally here because, yeah, a lot of the earlier Castlevania games can absolutely be a bit too punishing, especially the American versions of them. But for the games that I played for this video, I never found that they pushed back too hard. I mean, sure, having to get used to a lives system again was kind of annoying, but I couldn't help but laugh whenever I did lose all my lives and had to get sent back to the start of a stage, like a massive release of pressure was lifted off of me, and all I could do was laugh through the pain. It's an enjoyable tension that made for some amazing clutch boss battles which were super satisfying, genuine heart rate increasing stuff. So I come here fully expecting the game to completely bend me over, positioning myself half over the table even, excited, but it didn't get hard until the end, at which point it quickly ended and I turn around to see Haunted Castle awkwardly fumbling as I ask, was that it? I had a stupidly high amount of sub-weapon hearts stocked up because of how little I felt I needed to use them. The level design just never inconveniences you enough in a way where you need to think outside the box, where the whip isn't always the most useful tool. Checkpoints are also really frequent, considering how short the levels are, and dying to a boss respawns you inside the boss room, which is bizarre, and I'm honestly tempted to say is just bad game design. Like, if you die on the boss, the room only has a whip upgrade, so you can't even get sub-weapons for it. Not to mention, it removes so much tension of having to make it to the boss through one final gauntlet of level, which was exciting. Like, no wonder I barely used sub-weapons, the one part of the game where they're most helpful. If you die, you just completely lose your chance to use them. The difficulty doesn't really ramp up either, it all felt pretty samey to me. I do appreciate the quality of life stuff like falling down a pit no longer being an insta-kill. I definitely do not miss that. But just like the original, there still isn't really a lot of platforming in this game, so there's barely any pits to actually worry about falling into. Enemies don't do that much damage even on the final levels, and overall the game just doesn't throw a lot at you. The enemies you face at the end of the game are the same ones you've been fighting since level 1, and you rarely have to deal with or manage more than one of them at a time. The final form of Dracula was a nice step in the right direction, throwing a lot of stuff at you and being decently challenging, but at that point there's only a few minutes left of the game, and it still isn't really all that much compared to what the other games would throw at you, though definitely for the better in some cases. And even if you do die, you start the fight at the second phase. It's a fun game, but it's removed all the friction, and that friction is part of what made those other titles so enjoyable to me. I can appreciate why it's like this. It's a Classicvania bundled together with 3 Metroidvanias. I get the impression it's meant to be a beginner-friendly entry to that style of game for those who have only played the other. And it does do a great job of that, but those DS games are hard as hell too, right? I'm sure even if this was their first experience with this style of Castlevania game, they could have taken a bit more punishment. It's not like those DS game players are terrified of hard games. They're literally playing them already. And the thing is, all of this would have been fine, and I wouldn't complain about it if it did also cater to those players like me who have played a lot of those classic Castlevania games and are actually good at them. The type of freaks who can beat all of Chronicles in one evening and then all of Dracula X the very next day. It does have a hard mode that, yeah, is harder, it throws more enemies at you, and I think is a more interesting way to play through the game, but it's not harder in any really substantial way. I beat it on hard even faster than I did on normal. I'd have loved a few more modifiers in the options menu to tune the game more to what I would find difficult. Maybe being able to restrict mid-air jump control like in Rebirth, alter how I want checkpoints to function, or make knockback more punishing, but sadly not. I found hard mode more fun, but I still wouldn't call it hard. Overall then, while I do have my issues with the length and difficulty of the game, I did still get a lot of enjoyment out of it, and as long as you go into it not expecting a longer, harder game, would argue still is pretty great. A no friction but still satisfying experience, Haunted Castle Revisited does a great job of modernising the original arcade game and turning it into one of the best feeling Classicvanias to date, even if it doesn't do anything else apart from that. I wouldn't say it's worth getting the entire collection for like I did, but only being £20 and coming with 3 of the best DS games ever made does sweeten the deal a little. I'm not entirely sure why they decided this collection of DS games needed to have a remake of an arcade game in it, but I'm really glad they did, even if it does seem like a missed opportunity to not also include Rebirth. With the closure of the Wii shopping channel, the game isn't legally available to purchase anywhere anymore, and is barely available illegally. It feels like it's wallowing in obscurity right now, and with basically every major Castlevania game being available in some sort of current-gen collection, it really is running out of places it could be re-released in. I guess if they ever do a 3D Castlevania collection, that's probably its best bet. I mean, hell, it's no weirder than Haunted Castle being here. Either way though, I loved finally getting to play a brand new Castlevania game after all these years, especially a brand new classic Castlevania game, which I've always had a softer spot for in my heart. I hope that this remake, along with those recent Bloodstained games, revitalises interest in this style of game again, and that M2, the developers of Rebirth and Revisited, get another chance in the future to really show off what they can do, either in a completely original game, or maybe something like a remake of Belmont's Revenge. And I hope that this video also helps drive up that interest too, even if only a tiny bit.
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
It was not by my hand I was once again given flesh. I was called here by humans who wished to pay me tribute on Patreon. Sorry, Richter, give me a moment. I'd like to thank the following people for supporting me on Patreon. Cat, 4 High Heels, Trons, Scribbler Dude, Katie, Simon Rakowski, Sean Capterville, Jake, Dewey, Pepper Crab, Hypergolic Mukbang, Demi Bandage, and Cypress Implex. Also, a big thank you to the Alloy Baby for doing the beautiful art for this episode. You did such an incredible job with this one. And also just a big thank you to everyone watching right now, and for being so patient with me while I was moving. The move is pretty much all done now, and as you can see, this place is absolutely huge. Not to mention the entire second upside down castle the estate agents just forgot to tell us about before we moved in. So we have a lot of empty rooms. And honestly, most of our stuff is still in boxes. I haven't really had a lot of time to sort all that out yet, let alone getting around to hiring all the enemies I would need to protect this house from vampire hunters. The previous owners did leave some contact details for Frankenstein's monster and the Grim Reaper, but my phone signal here sucks. I mean, the contract did say that this was a risk, but it is a bit annoying. I wasn't expecting a hunter to come here so fast, but I guess that's on me for not being prepared. Anyway, this bit is running its course, so I'm gonna end this segment now before it gets any more stale, and conveniently before... Ah, fuck. No, I kept talking too long, and now I've been killed. Oh, I'm such a bad vampire. Oh no.